Notice, the following language and words may be harsh to your ear and difficult to hear. Listeners, be advised. So it's not really that bad. So this is actually from the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. It's an internet website. Richard Dawkins is possibly the most famous, well-known atheist, kind of advocate for atheism in our day. And he has a website, and people make various comments on it. This was a comment by someone else on that website. So, and it has to do with the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, Lisbon in Portugal. So in 1755, there was this huge earthquake that hit Lisbon, the city of Lisbon, Portugal. And it was, that's like 250 years ago, right? So as best we can understand, it was about an 8.5 or 9 magnitude on the Richter scale, so huge. Just offshore, it was offshore in the Atlantic, and along with the earthquake, there was a huge tsunami, like a tidal wave, and it wiped out, we don't even know. So 250 years ago, there were varying accounts of, they weren't keeping very good track back then, of course. Probably 40 or 50,000 people, something like that, were killed that day. So this is the comment this person made on the website. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake was so terrible and happened on a holy day that it had a huge effect on the thinking of many people about whether God exists, and inspired essays by many now famous philosophers arguing God does not exist. Why God allows evil is a question people have been asking for centuries, and the only rational answer is He doesn't exist. Some people will hold on to cherished beliefs in the face of mountains of evidence, but this evidence does eventually sway some. So, strong language, right? He says, the only rational answer is He doesn't exist because of the mountains of evidence. And so that's a conclusion that some people, obviously this fellow and many of the other comments on the website led me to believe that they were in agreement with that perspective. So many people in our day, not the majority, but quite a few, have come to that conclusion. And that, it's just must not be a God if there's all this suffering. So now, if you have a real experience of God, if you have experienced Christ in your life, in your heart, and it's a real, and I will say this again, I've said it before, that as far as I'm concerned, Christianity is not just a bunch of doctrines or teachings that you happen to accept intellectually. It's the encounter with the living God. It's actually knowing God. It's actually walking, like sensing and knowing and experiencing the presence of God and of Jesus Christ in your heart and in your life, knowing His forgiveness through the cross and Him walking with you by His Spirit. So it's the experience of that. So if you've had that, this may seem ridiculous and just terribly far-fetched and off the track. But for those who have not had that kind of experience, they can quite readily be swayed to be thinking this way. It sounds quite reasonable. And in fact, on this website, that basically they would contend that thinking people will hold that view. It says the only rational answer is He doesn't exist, right? And on the other hand, they would say anybody that does buy into that there's a God or that Jesus is real, etc., is delusional. We're deluded. In fact, Richard Dawkins wrote a very famous book called The God Delusion. Basically, that's his premise. But those of us, all you guys that are coming to church because you believe in God, and me who preach, the existence of God and the resurrection of Christ, we're deluded. So that's alongside of the number one question that people have, probably that purportedly holds them back from believing and of faith is the question of suffering. I'm just going to use the word evil for everything, like suffering, tragedies. Violence, the whole gambit of things that are kind of wrong with the world. We'll just call that evil. But when Alpha did a survey of this, when the Alpha course, they wanted to talk to people about the biggest questions that people have, and also Lee Strobel, who's an American apologist, he did a survey in America. So Alpha happens in England, this happens in the States. Both of them, the top question that comes up is, or deliberation or query is, if there is this God that you claim who is so good and so all-powerful, Why is there so much evil and suffering in this world? And I've had a friend who's an atheist basically say to me, if I were God, I would not have allowed all that. Interesting. So the question, or the objection, I suppose, if you will, to the existence of God in that is kind of assumes that we can do God better than God can. You ever think of that? So it means whoever really buys into this knows that they know better. If they were God, they would do it like this. They know how to do God better than God does. And they have a better idea how to wisely run the world, the universe, the history than God does. So now, the 11th chapter of John, from which Jane read earlier, is about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. But it's also about this very question, of which I have referenced and kind of brought us to. Now, in Jesus' day, I'll get around to it. It's a bit of a different question, because the existence of God was not questioned as it is now. So, by the way, the reading for the day was pretty much a much bigger chunk of the Gospel of John chapter 11 than what Jane read. So, A, we gave Jane a break, and B, we gave you a break, because your minds might have wandered a little bit, should we have read that whole thing. So, but to take you back to the beginning of the chapter, there's this other theme that kind of weaves through the whole chapter, which is eventually, ostensibly, about the raising of Lazarus. So, for instance, at the very beginning, Lazarus is dying. Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha. Remember the sisters, Mary and Martha, friends of Jesus? And Lazarus is their brother. They live in a place called Bethany, which is on the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles to the east of Jerusalem. So just outside of the city of Jerusalem. At the time when this chapter starts, Jesus is not around. He's somewhere. He might be up in Galilee. He's way off somewhere. Mary and Martha have sent word to him that Lazarus is very sick, and they want him to come. And it says, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. This is verse 6. So I don't know if you've ever read that and kind of scratched your head a little bit. What's going on here? So that's the first clue we have, that this is a theme throughout the chapter. Then when he does finally get there, the first thing that Martha comes out to meet. Remember, Martha she is the practical one. She's always the one working in the kitchen. Mary is the kind of daydreaming one. She's always sitting at Jesus' feet. And I won't even, you remember that story. So Martha comes running out to Jesus fairly quickly upon his arrival, and Mary's just too upset. She's distraught. She's the emotional one. She's staying home. And she says to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. So she's like, Jesus, you're not really living up to my expectations here. So then some verses later, which is in our reading today, that Jane started reading in verse 32, when Mary reached the place, so then Mary finally does come out, and when she gets there, guess what she says? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Okay, so he delayed 2 days. He gets there. They're complaining that he didn't show up early enough. And then both the sisters are. And then a few verses later, verse 37, it says, some of them said, so the neighbors and the community are gathered around mourning Lazarus at this point. And they say, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? So everybody's a little bit ticked off with Jesus. Everybody's a critic, right? So I'm saying that, so just as everybody knows how to be, apparently a lot of people know how to be God better than God knows how to be God. A lot of people know how to be the Messiah better than Jesus knew how to be the Messiah. And they've got some advice for how he should have been doing things. Now there's 2 parts to the answer. And I think it's important. So I think it may not be the answer that our world is looking for, but I think this is God's biggest answer to the question of suffering, is actually kind of injected into this chapter, if you will. So part 1, true, Jesus deliberately waited for Lazarus to die. He allowed the suffering that Lazarus went through. He was sick, he was suffering, and he was dying. So he allowed that to happen. And that's not a pleasant thing. I mean, I haven't died yet, but, I'm not really looking forward to it. Are any of us? I mean, it's, when we cross that river, my hope is in Christ, so I'm okay. I'm trusting that I'll be fine, and I know I will. But, we haven't gone through that. There's suffering involved with that. Not only that, there's the grief of all the suffering and the grief of all of the sisters and the whole community who are very upset. They really liked this guy. He was dear to them, and now they're in sorrow because he's gone. So Jesus allowed all that. And the point is, I believe, that he was using this as an opportunity to demonstrate his solidarity with us. I mean, he could have healed him. He could have come early. He did a lot of healings. And he blessed a lot of people with his healings. But this time he didn't. And I believe it was to demonstrate his solidarity with us. He was showing his deep compassion and concern for the human condition. He was showing his deep compassion and concern for the human condition. And in this chapter, more, I think, than in any other spot in all the gospel writings, we get a glimpse at how Jesus really felt when he was dealing with these kinds of things. So verse 33, it says, "When Jesus saw her weeping," this is Mary, "and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled." Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Nowhere else do we have this kind of description of his emotional state at the time. So he's entering into their grief. Then verse 35, two-word verse, Jesus wept. Poignant, really. I mean, it's the shortest verse in the entire Bible. Jesus cried along with them. Jesus wept. And then a few verses later, Jesus, verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. So we have a description of the emotional state of Jesus in the face of the death of someone he really cared about and loved. And that's just kind of entering into the normal kinds of things that we enter into. Because all of us have lost people that are near and dear to us, and we've suffered that way. Now we see that Jesus also went through that. But then beyond that, a few weeks later, he's going to go through much more, horrid situation, which is his own sufferings and his own crucifixion, which is one of the cruelest ways to die, and then subsequently his death. So not only did he go through kind of the routine ways that we suffer in losing a friend or losing someone close by, he himself suffered and died for our sakes. But he also demonstrated that he's with us in the midst of all those kinds of things. And in one of a few chapters later, I think it's in chapter 14, one of the disciples says to him, "Show us the Father, and that will suffice." And Jesus says to him, "He who has seen me has seen the Father," which is powerful. So what he's saying is, the way that Jesus is doing things here, the things that he's revealing in even in his emotional outpouring here, is a demonstration of what God is like, and what God feels, what the Father feels in the midst of human suffering. So if we think that he's kind of off the side, he's kind of aloof, he's kind of way up there, or they deserve that, so too bad, it's not the case. I mean, Jesus is clearly indicating that is not the case, that he very, very much is troubled and upset and in sorrow over the sufferings of humankind. So whatever reasons God may have for allowing suffering, and that's another question. I've got some answers for that, which may or may not make you happy. Partly having to do with the fallen nature, the rebelliousness of ourselves, of the human race, and kind of the consequences for sinfulness. That's part of it. And free choice that God has given us in love. Those are part of the answers, but I'm not even going to get into that because that's a whole lecture unto itself. But whatever God's reasons are for allowing evil, for allowing suffering, he deeply cares. Are we in pain? He really cares. Are we in sorrow? Are we in grief? He cares. Is there tragedy? He cares. Is there war? He deeply cares. Are there disasters where many people die? He deeply cares. In fact, our caring, the fact that you and I care, is just a small reflection of his caring. I think we kind of brag like we care more than anybody. Well, of course we don't. We are made in God's image. So the reason that we care is because we are made in the image and likeness of God. And we are reflecting that image in his image in us when we care and we have compassion and we're in solidarity with those around us who are suffering, and we're troubled. That's a little teeny reflection of the great, huge heart of our God. Peter says in his epistle, the Apostle Peter, cast all your cares on him, for he cares for you. He advises us and admonishes us to cast our burdens, our cares, our worries, our anxieties on the Lord. Why? Because he cares for us. We matter to him. And the things that we're going through, small, big, in between, they all matter to him. And I think that we need to know this, that that's what he's like. And that's what Jesus is demonstrating. And he powerfully really displays that truth in this passage. Jesus wept. So that's part one. And part two, quite simply, he raises the dead. He raises the dead. So the end of the story, which Jane read, is quite dramatic. After they'd had conversations, they were all crying and upset. He says, okay, roll the stone away. It's interesting how this is kind of a very parallel to what's going to happen to Jesus. I mean, he's in the tomb for a few days. There's a cave. There's a stone rolled around it. He's wrapped up in bandages or in cloths. Exact same thing happens to Jesus a couple of weeks later. Excuse me. So Jesus says, well, roll the stone away. And one of the sisters says, Lord, he's been in there 4 days. Not going to smell good. And he says, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And so they do it. They're skeptical, of course. And then it says he prays, and then he yells in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. So it's pretty dramatic. Now, obviously, he doesn't raise everybody like he did Lazarus. That's not the usual thing that happens in the human experience. But the point is that Jesus sees beyond the grave. He is the Lord, both of the living and of the dead, according to Scripture. In his conversation with Martha a little earlier on, when he first came, he says to her, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. That, by the way, is a very key passage in the Gospel of John, because in John there's a lot of sevens. There's 7 I ams, which I will not list all before you. I have done that in the past. I am the true vine. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and life. Here it is. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. Jesus declares this to us, and he promises this to us. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. So we will all die, but Jesus promises that we will be raised and that we will be somehow miraculously put back together again, right? And God will restore us, and we will be entirely healed, and we will be perfected forever. And all the sorrow and sighing and death and sickness and pain will be gone forever. That's what the resurrection's about, when Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He takes away the sting for us and the fear and the anxiety of death. There's one thing to say it. Jesus doesn't just say things, he acts along with what he says. So he says, I am the resurrection and the life, and then he proceeds to raise Lazarus from the dead. So he proves who he is and that what he says is true by raising Lazarus, and then, of course, subsequently, he himself comes back from the dead after dying. This is crucial stuff for our faith, for Christian faith. So it's not just that God is with us in our suffering, but that he sees the other side too. We think kind of death is the end, it's the worst thing that can happen to you. From God's perspective, that's not the case. For all are alive to him, the living and the dead. So can we answer all the skeptics? Richard Dawkinses and the cynics of this world to their satisfaction? Can I say, you guys need to read John 11? And they'll say, oh, now I get it. Probably not going to happen. But Jesus shows us that God enters into our world of suffering and that he does have a plan to end it once and for all. Shall we pray?